So you've got 18,000 American soldiers completely surrounded by 45,000 Germans. They are freezing. They are starving. They are running out of bullets. The smart move? Surrender. But these weren't smart soldiers. These were the 101st Airborne. And when America's most legendary general smashed through enemy lines to save them, they looked him dead in the eyes and said something that would go down in history as the ultimate flex. This isn't just a war story. This is a masterclass in American attitude. Let's break it down. To understand why what the 101st Airborne said was so legendary, we need to rewind. Not to the moment Patton showed up. But how did these paratroopers end up in the most desperate situation of World War II in the first place? It's December 1944. The Allies think they've basically won the war. Hitler's on his last legs. The German army is crumbling. Everyone's planning what they're gonna do when they get home for Christmas. And then Hitler does something nobody expects. He launches the biggest German offensive since 1940. 200,000 German soldiers. 1,000 tanks. 2,000 artillery pieces. All of them smashing through the Ardennes forest in Belgium like a freight train through a picket fence. The Allies don't see it coming. Their lines crumble. Entire divisions get wiped out in hours. This is the Battle of the Bulge. And right in the middle of all this chaos is a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Now, you might be thinking, why does a tiny Belgian town matter? Here's why: 7 major roads converge at Bastogne. If you control Bastogne, you control the entire region. The Germans know this. The Americans know this. And whoever holds that crossroads is going to determine the outcome of the entire battle. So the Americans rush reinforcements to Bastogne. And who do they send? The 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles. These are paratroopers. Elite soldiers trained to jump behind enemy lines and cause absolute mayhem. They've already fought in Normandy. They've already fought in Holland. They are some of the toughest soldiers in the entire American army. But here's the problem: they are being sent to Bastogne without proper equipment. These guys are supposed to be resting in France. They've just come off brutal combat in Operation Market Garden. They don't have enough ammunition. They don't have enough food. They don't have winter clothing. And they're being loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night and told to hold a position that's about to be surrounded by the entire German army. The 101st arrives in Bastogne on December 19, 1944. By December 21st, they are completely surrounded. The Germans have closed the ring. There's no way out. No supplies can get in. The weather is so bad that American planes can't fly. These paratroopers are on their own. Now let me paint you a picture of what "on their own" actually means. The temperature is below zero. Snow is everywhere. These soldiers don't have proper boots. Some of them are wrapping their feet in newspaper to prevent frostbite. They are running so low on ammunition that they are rationing every bullet. Officers are telling men not to fire unless they can see the whites of the enemy's eyes. Medical supplies are almost gone. The medics are performing surgeries without anesthesia. But wait, it gets worse. The Germans bring up heavy artillery. They start bombarding Bastogne day and night. The Americans can hear German tanks rumbling in the forests around them. They know an assault is coming. They just don't know when, and here's what makes the 101st different from any other unit. They are not scared. I mean, sure, they are humans, so they are probably terrified on some level. But their training kicks in. Airborne soldiers are trained to be surrounded. That's literally their job. You jump behind enemy lines, you're surrounded by definition. So while a normal unit might panic, the 101st just digs deeper foxholes and cracks dark jokes. General Anthony McAuliffe is the acting commander of the 101st in Bastogne. The real commander, General Maxwell Taylor, is back in Washington for a conference. So McAuliffe is the guy in charge of this impossible situation. And by all accounts, he's the perfect man for the job. He's calm under pressure. He's got a dry sense of humor. And he absolutely refuses to even consider the possibility of defeat. On December 22, 1944, something unusual happens. 4 German soldiers approach the American lines under a white flag. They are carrying a message from the German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz. The message is a formal demand for surrender. Now, let's be clear about what this demand says. The Germans aren't threatening. They are almost polite. The message basically says, look, you're surrounded. You can't win. If you keep fighting, we're going to have to destroy you with artillery. We don't want that. You don't want that. So just surrender now and save everyone the trouble. The German commander even offers the well-known American humanity as a reason to give up. The German officers who deliver this message are blindfolded and brought to the American command post. They are expecting the Americans to at least consider the offer. Maybe negotiate. Maybe ask for terms. At minimum, they expect a polite military response. What they get instead is something nobody sees coming. General McAuliffe reads the surrender demand. And according to everyone who was there, his first reaction was confusion. Not about what the Germans want. About why they would even bother asking. They want us to surrender? McAuliffe says. And then he laughs. Not a nervous laugh. A genuine, amused laugh. Like someone just told him a good joke. His staff officers gather around. What should we say, General? How do we respond to this? McAuliffe thinks for about 2 seconds. Then he says one word. Nuts. His staff officers look at each other. Sir? McAuliffe shrugs. Just tell them nuts. Now, the staff has to actually write this response down and give it to the Germans. They type it up on official stationery. The entire response reads, to the German commander, NUTS. From the American commander. That's it. That's the whole message. The German officers receiving this response are completely baffled. Remember, these are professional German military officers who speak English as a second language. They have no idea what nuts means. Is this a code? Is this an insult? Is this some kind of American military terminology? Colonel Joseph Harper, the officer delivering McAuliffe's response, has to explain it to them. He tells the Germans, it means the same as, go to hell. And I'll tell you something else, if you continue to attack, we will kill every German who tries to break into this city. The Germans are escorted back to their lines. And just like that, the 101st Airborne has given the German army the most American response possible to a surrender demand. But here's the thing, saying, nuts, is easy when you're safe. These guys weren't safe. They were absolutely, genuinely about to get annihilated. The Germans responded to the rejection by launching massive attacks. Artillery barrages intensified. German infantry and tanks probed the American lines constantly. December 23, December 24, Christmas Eve in Bastogne. The Americans are still holding, but barely. Ammunition is almost gone. Food is almost gone. Hope? Well, that's the one thing they seem to have plenty of, and then something changes. The weather clears. For the first time in days, the skies over Belgium are blue. American pilots can finally fly. And what follows is one of the most beautiful sights in military history for the soldiers on the ground. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes appear over Bastogne. Parachutes start blooming in the sky. But these aren't soldiers jumping. These are supplies. Ammunition. Food. Medical equipment. Even Christmas packages. The 101st literally gets an airdrop on Christmas Eve. The supply drop changes everything. Now the Americans have bullets. Now they can fight. And fight they do. German attacks on Christmas Day are beaten back with heavy casualties. The ring around Bastogne holds, but the siege isn't over. The 101st is still surrounded. They are still outnumbered. And while they can hold, they can't break out on their own. They need help. They need reinforcements. They need the one man crazy enough to attempt what everyone else says is impossible. Enter General George S. Patton. Now, if you don't know who George Patton is, Let me give you the quick version. Patton is the most aggressive, most flamboyant, most controversial general in the American Army. He's the guy who slapped a soldier with PTSD and nearly got fired for it. He's the guy who believes in reincarnation and thinks he was a Roman soldier in a past life. He's the guy who carries ivory-handled revolvers and gives profanity-laced speeches that would make a sailor blush. And he's also, without question, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the 20th century. When the Battle of the Bulge starts, Patton's Third Army is in the Sau region, fighting its own battle against the Germans. Patton is pushing toward Germany itself. He's got momentum. He's winning. And then he gets the call, the Ardennes is collapsing. Bastogne is surrounded. The entire Allied position in Belgium might fall. On December 19, just 3 days after the German offensive began, Patton attended a meeting with General Eisenhower and other Allied commanders. The mood is grim. Everyone's trying to figure out how to stop the German advance. Eisenhower asks Patton when he can disengage from his current operations and attack north into the Bulge. Patton's response stuns everyone in the room. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals think he's lost his mind. You can't turn an entire army 90 degrees and launch an offensive in 48 hours. It's logistically impossible. Patton must be exaggerating to look tough. But Patton isn't exaggerating. He's already ordered his staff to start planning the turn before the meeting even began. Because that's who Patton is. While everyone else is reacting to the crisis, Patton is already 3 moves ahead. And he delivers. On December 22, the same day McAuliffe says, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand, Patton's Third Army begins its attack north toward Bastogne. 100,000 men. Hundreds of tanks. All of them smashing through German lines in the dead of winter. The conditions are brutal. Snow. Ice. Frozen mud. Visibility near zero. German resistance is fierce. But Patton drives his men like a man possessed. He's got one goal: break through to Bastogne and relieve the 101 St. December 23. The 4th Armored Division leads the charge. They fight through German roadblocks. They push through defended villages. They lose tanks. They lose men. But they keep going. December 24. Still fighting. Still pushing. Patton is everywhere at once, screaming at officers, encouraging enlisted men, and personally directing traffic at crossroads. He will not let this attack fail. December 25, Christmas Day. While the 101st is fighting off German attacks inside Bastogne, Patton's forces are just miles away. So close. So agonizingly close. But German resistance stiffens. The relief force bogs down in fierce fighting around villages with names Americans can't pronounce. December 26. The day that changes everything. At approximately 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, elements of the 4th Armored Division, specifically the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, finally punched through the German lines and reached Bastogne. Let me set the scene. After a week of hell, the 101st Airborne sees American tanks rolling toward their positions. Not German tanks. American tanks. Sherman tanks with white stars on the sides. Tanks filled with soldiers who haven't been eating frozen K-rations for a week. Tanks loaded with ammunition and supplies, and everything the 101st desperately needs. The siege of Bastogne is broken. Now, this is where most history books end the story. Patton saves the day. The 101st is rescued. Everyone celebrates Christmas a day late. Roll credits. But that's not how it actually went down. Because when Patton's forces rolled into Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had something to say. And what they said has become one of the most legendary responses in military history. The story goes like this: when the first elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the 101 ST's lines, an officer from Patton's command supposedly said something along the lines of, "We're here to rescue you." The response from the 101st? Rescue, hell. We've been holding this place for you guys. Let that sink in for a second. These men have just survived one of the most brutal sieges in American military history. They've been surrounded for a week. They've been outnumbered, outgunned, and freezing to death. Artillery shells have been falling on their heads for days. They've watched friends die in their arms. And when reinforcements finally arrive, instead of falling to their knees in gratitude, they basically tell Patton's guys to check their ego. That's not arrogance. That's identity. The 101st Airborne Division didn't see itself as victims who needed saving. They saw themselves as warriors who had a job to do. Their job was to hold Bastogne. And they held Bastogne. The fact that they were surrounded? That was incidental. The fact that they were outnumbered? So what? They were paratroopers. Being outnumbered behind enemy lines was the job description. But here's what makes this even more legendary: they were right. The 101st didn't just survive at Bastogne. They dominated. In a week of fighting, the Germans threw everything they had at this crossroads town. Multiple divisions. Tanks. Artillery. Luftwaffe bombers. And the 101st held. Every single time. The Germans suffered massive casualties trying to take Bastogne. Every failed assault cost them men and equipment they couldn't replace. Every day the 101st held was another day the German offensive lost momentum. By the time Patton broke through, the German attack had already started to stall, in no small part because of what the 101st accomplished. So when those paratroopers said, "Rescue," hell, they weren't being ungrateful. They were stating a fact. They hadn't been waiting to be rescued. They'd been doing exactly what they were supposed to do, holding the line and making the enemy pay for every inch. Now, let's talk about what happened next, because the story doesn't end with Patton's arrival. Breaking the siege of Bastogne didn't mean the battle was over. The Germans weren't about to let this strategic crossroads go without a fight. For the next several weeks, the fighting around Bastogne continued. Some of the most intense combat of the entire Battle of the Bulge happened after the siege was broken. German counterattacks slammed into the expanded perimeter. The corridor that Patton's forces had opened was narrow and vulnerable. At several points, the Germans nearly cut it again. The 101st and the 4th Armored had to fight just as hard to keep the road open as they had to break through in the first place. January 1945 saw some of the bitterest fighting of the entire war. The snow kept falling. The temperatures kept dropping. Soldiers on both sides froze in their foxholes. The ground was so hard that graves couldn't be dug. Bodies had to be stacked like cordwood until spring. But gradually, the tide turned. The Germans couldn't sustain their offensive. They'd gambled everything on the Battle of the Bulge, and they'd lost. By mid-January, the Bulge was shrinking. By the end of the month, the lines were back where they'd started. Hitler's last major offensive had failed. And at the center of that failure was Bastogne. The crossroads that wouldn't fall. The paratroopers who wouldn't surrender. The one word that became a symbol of American defiance: nuts. But I want to dig deeper into why this moment resonated so strongly with the American public, and why it still resonates today. World War II was filled with heroic stands. The Marines on Wake Island. The defenders of Corregidor. The soldiers at Anzio. But Bastogne captured something unique. It wasn't just about survival. It was about attitude. The "nut" response became instant legend. Newspapers back home ran the story on front pages. McAuliffe became a celebrity. The 101st Airborne became synonymous with American toughness. And the story of what the paratroopers said when Patton arrived became the perfect punchline to the whole affair. Why did it resonate so much? Because it captured something essential about American self-image. Americans like to see themselves as the underdog who refuses to quit. The scrappy fighter who won't take disrespect from anyone. The person who, when told the situation is hopeless, just laughs and asks for more ammunition. Bastogne was all of that in one package. Surrounded? So what? Outnumbered? Big deal. The Germans want us to surrender? Tell them to go to hell. Patton's here to rescue us. Rescue, hell. We've been holding this place down. It's defiance as identity. It's not just about winning. It's about how you carry yourself while you fight. The 101st could have been grateful when Patton showed up. They could have said, "Thank God you're here," and nobody would have blamed them. But that wasn't who they were. They were screaming eagles. They didn't need saving. They just needed more bullets now. Let's zoom out and talk about what this battle meant for the rest of the war. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. He threw everything he had left into one desperate offensive, hoping to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace. If it worked, Germany might survive. If it failed, there was nothing left. It failed. And Bastogne was a big part of why. By holding the crossroads, the 101st prevented the Germans from exploiting their initial breakthrough. The German armor that should have been racing toward the Meuse River and beyond was instead stuck trying to crack a nut they couldn't crack. Days that should have been spent gaining territory were instead spent dying in front of American positions. Time was the one thing the Germans didn't have. Every day the offensive stalled, the Allies grew stronger. Reinforcements poured in from all over the Western Front. The weather cleared, allowing American air power to devastate German supply lines. Patton's Third Army pivoted and attacked, threatening to cut off the entire German penetration. By holding Bastogne, the 101st Airborne didn't just save themselves. They helped save the entire Allied position in Western Europe. The Battle of the Bulge became Germany's death knell instead of a stunning reversal. For months later, Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe was over. So when those paratroopers said, "Rescue, hell," they weren't just being cocky. They were speaking with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they'd accomplished. They hadn't been waiting for rescue. They'd been winning the war. Let me tell you some of the individual stories from Bastogne, because the legend is really made up of thousands of smaller heroics that history often overlooks. Take the medics. The 101st Airborne's medical personnel performed miracles during the siege. Working in a bombed-out Belgian building, surgeons operated by flashlight. They ran out of plasma, so they gave direct blood transfusions, soldier to soldier. When anesthesia ran low, they had to prioritize who got it. Men underwent amputations while biting down on leather straps. One medic, Private First Class Forrest Guth, made multiple trips into no man's land to retrieve wounded soldiers. Under fire. In the snow. With German snipers everywhere. He did it because his brothers were out there bleeding, and that was his job. Or take the case of Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnaird, who was McAuliffe's operations officer. He's actually credited with coming up with the "nut" response. When McAuliffe muttered the word in response to the surrender demand, Kinnaird said, "Sir, that would be hard to beat." And so it became the official reply. Then there's Sergeant Oswald Butler, who delivered McAuliffe's message to the German officers. As he handed over the typed response, one of the Germans asked what "nut" meant. Butler, with a straight face, explained that it was a polite way of saying the general's reply was unprintable. These individual moments add up to something larger than any single act of heroism. They paint a picture of an entire division that had bought into a culture of excellence and defiance. From the generals down to the privates, everyone in the 101st believed they were the best. And in Bastogne, they proved it. But let's also acknowledge the human cost, because this isn't just a story of victory. The siege of Bastogne and the subsequent fighting cost the 101st Airborne dearly. Hundreds of soldiers died. Hundreds more were wounded. Many lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Some suffered wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And the psychological toll was just as heavy. Watching friends die. Living in constant fear of artillery. Going days without proper food or rest. The stress was unimaginable. Many veterans of Bastogne carried those scars for the rest of their lives. I say this not to diminish the heroism, but to contextualize it. When those paratroopers made jokes about not needing rescue, they weren't speaking from a place of comfort. They were speaking from a place of trauma, exhaustion, and loss. The humor was a coping mechanism. The defiance was a survival strategy. They joked because if they stopped to think about what they'd been through, they might break. That makes their attitude even more remarkable, doesn't it? These weren't fresh troops cracking wise from safety. These were shattered men who had somehow found a way to stay unbroken in the worst circumstances imaginable. And when relief finally came, they chose to define the moment on their own terms. Now let's talk about the relationship between Patton and the 101st, because there's an interesting dynamic there that often gets overlooked. Patton was Army. The 101st was airborne. And in World War II, there was a definite rivalry between the regular Army and the airborne forces. Paratroopers considered themselves elite. They looked down on regular infantry as legs who couldn't keep up. Regular Army units sometimes resented the airborne swagger and preferential treatment. Patton himself had a complicated relationship with the airborne concept. He respected courage and fighting spirit, which the paratroopers had in abundance. But he was fundamentally a tank man. He believed in armored warfare, in mobility, in the kind of sweeping maneuver that his Third Army specialized in. The siege of Bastogne was a static defensive battle. That was exactly the opposite of everything Patton believed in. He wanted to attack, always attack, never defend. The idea of sitting in a defensive position waiting to be relieved went against every instinct he had. So when Patton's forces reached Bastogne, there might have been a subtext to the 101st's response. We did what you could never do. We held. We didn't need tanks or mobility. We just needed guts. Of course, this is speculation. The historical record doesn't capture every side conversation and meaningful glance. But knowing military culture and knowing the egos involved, it's not hard to imagine some professional pride mixing with the relief of that December day. Patton, for his part, seems to have respected what the 101st accomplished. He wasn't the type to praise easily, but he understood what they'd achieved. In his diaries and letters, Patton acknowledges the importance of Bastogne and the role the defenders played in the overall success of the campaign. The truth is, both sides were right. The 101st couldn't have held forever. Eventually, ammunition and food would have run out completely. Eventually, the German assaults would have broken through. They needed relief. And Patton's Third Army provided it with one of the most impressive logistical and tactical feats of the war. But the 101st was also right that they'd done more than just survive. They'd fought the Germans to a standstill. They'd bought the time that the rest of the Allied forces needed. They'd proved that American soldiers could hold against the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. So, rescue, hell, wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. A more accurate statement might have been, rescue. No? Reinforcement? Yes. But we were never in danger of quitting. We just needed more of everything so we could keep killing Germans. But that's not as punchy, is it? Let me now turn to the legacy of Bastogne and why this story matters today. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the United States Army fought in World War II. More Americans fought in the Bulge than in any other engagement before or since. The casualties were staggering, 89,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed. It was a brutal, desperate fight in horrific conditions, yet the story that emerged from all that carnage was one of hope. The nuts reply. The Screaming Eagles. Patton's impossible relief march. The underdog who refused to break. These became the defining images of the battle, and they shaped how Americans understood the war. In the decades since, Bastogne has become a pilgrimage site for military history enthusiasts and veterans alike. The town itself has preserved numerous memorials and museums dedicated to the battle. Every year on the anniversary, ceremonies are held to honor the fallen. The 101st Airborne Division is still active today. And guess what their nickname is? The Screaming Eagles. Same as it was in 1944. And among their proudest traditions is the defense of Bastogne. New soldiers who join the 101st learn about McAuliffe and his one-word reply. They learn about the siege and the relief. They learn that the 101st doesn't give up. That's the real legacy of what the 101st said when Patton arrived. It wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a statement of identity that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. It says, "We are not victims. We are fighters. We do not wait to be saved. We hold our ground and make the enemy regret ever coming near us." And that attitude isn't just military. It's become part of the broader American cultural identity. When people talk about American resilience, American toughness, American refusal to quit, they are often unconsciously channeling the spirit of Bastogne. The can-do attitude. The dark humor in the face of disaster. The belief that no situation is hopeless if you're willing to fight. Of course, this mythology has its limits. Not every problem can be solved with guts and determination. Sometimes the odds really are impossible. Sometimes the smart move is to retreat, regroup, and fight another day. The nuts mentality can shade into recklessness if taken too far. But as a source of inspiration, as a reminder of what humans are capable of when pushed to the limit, Bastogne remains powerful. These weren't superheroes. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things because their backs were against the wall and they refused to break. Let's also talk about the German perspective, because this story has another side. The German soldiers attacking Bastogne weren't evil automatons. Many of them were conscripts fighting because they had no choice. Many were veterans who had been fighting since 1939 and were exhausted, demoralized, and running on fumes. Many knew the war was lost but kept fighting out of duty, fear, or simple lack of alternatives. The German commanders made a strategic error by not taking Bastogne quickly when they had the chance. In the opening days of the offensive, when the American lines were in chaos, the Germans might have been able to seize the crossroads before the 101st arrived. But they hesitated. They bypassed the town to pursue other objectives. By the time they turned their full attention to Bastogne, the 101st was dug in and ready. This hesitation was partly due to the overall plan of the offensive, which prioritized speed over securing every objective. But it was also partly due to the German commanders' uncertainty about American strength in the area. They thought they might be facing a larger force than they were. The 101st's aggressive patrolling and fighting spirit contributed to this misperception. In other words, the 101st's attitude wasn't just for show. It had tactical value. By acting like they were stronger than they were, by refusing to show any sign of weakness, they made the Germans cautious. And that caution cost the Germans precious time. When the surrender demand came on December 22, the German commander genuinely believed he was doing the Americans a favor. He thought they were beaten and just hadn't admitted it yet. The "nut" reply wasn't just an insult. It was information. It told the Germans that the Americans weren't going to crack easily. And that information shaped German decisions for the rest of the battle. So in a weird way, McAuliffe's one-word reply might have saved lives on both sides. If the Americans had shown weakness, the Germans might have pressed their attack more aggressively, leading to even bloodier fighting. By signaling that they were ready to fight to the death, the Americans may have convinced the Germans to be more cautious than they otherwise would have been. This is the kind of psychological warfare that doesn't show up in casualty figures or battle maps. It's about perception, morale, and will. And the 101st won that battle decisively. Now I want to address some of the myths and controversies around Bastogne, because no historical event is free from distortion and debate. First, the "nut" reply. While the basic story is true, there's some debate about the exact wording and context. McAuliffe himself initially couldn't remember exactly what he said, and it was his staff who reminded him that he'd said "nuts." The official version of the story has become somewhat polished over the years, and some details may have been embellished for dramatic effect. Second, the line, "rescue, hell." There's actually significant debate about whether this exact phrase was ever spoken, and if so, by whom. Some accounts attribute it to a specific officer. Other accounts suggest it was a more general attitude rather than a specific quotation. The historical record is murky because the chaos of battle doesn't lend itself to accurate record keeping. What we can say is that the sentiment was real. The 101st did not see themselves as having been rescued. They saw themselves as having held until reinforced. Multiple veterans of Bastogne have confirmed this attitude in interviews and memoirs. Whether the specific phrase, rescue, hell, was spoken exactly as legend has it is less important than the fact that it accurately captures what the soldiers felt. Third, there's the question of credit. The 101st Airborne was the most famous unit at Bastogne, but they weren't alone. Elements of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various artillery and support units also fought in the defense. The siege was a team effort, but the popular narrative focuses almost exclusively on the 101st. This isn't surprising. The 101st had the better story, paratroopers surrounded by enemies, fighting against impossible odds. They had the nuts quote. They had the glamour of the airborne forces. And they had effective public relations in the form of journalists who embedded with the unit and wrote favorable stories. The other units at Bastogne sometimes feel overlooked by history. Their contribution was real and significant, but they don't get the same recognition. This is a common problem in military history. Certain units become famous while others remain obscure, even when both contributed equally to victory. Finally, there's the question of Patton's role. Patton's relief of Bastogne was genuinely impressive. Moving 100,000 men 90 degrees in 48 hours in the middle of winter is one of the great feats of military logistics. But Patton also benefited from favorable circumstances. The weather cleared just as he was approaching Bastogne, allowing air support and supply drops that made his task easier. And the German offensive was already starting to culminate, meaning resistance was less fierce than it might have been a few days earlier. None of this diminishes what Patton accomplished. But it does suggest that the narrative of Patton single-handedly saving Bastogne is oversimplified. Like most military operations, the relief of Bastogne was a team effort that depended on thousands of decisions and actions by people at every level. Let me now discuss some of the key personalities in more depth, because understanding the individuals helps us understand the event. General Anthony McAuliffe, the man who said, "nuts," was an artillery officer by training. He wasn't originally airborne. He had transferred to the 101st Airborne Division to command its artillery, and he ended up as acting commander only because General Maxwell Taylor was absent. McAuliffe was known for being calm, collected, and laconic. He wasn't a screamer or a self-promoter. He led by example and expected his subordinates to do their jobs without excessive oversight. In many ways, he was the opposite of Patton, quiet where Patton was loud, understated where Patton was theatrical. The "nut" response was completely in character for McAuliffe. It wasn't a calculated PR move. It was just how he talked. When faced with an absurd situation, the Germans asking him to surrender when he had no intention of doing so, he gave an absurd response. The fact that it became legendary was almost an accident. After the war, McAuliffe rose to the rank of full general and served in various commands until his retirement in 1956. He died in 1975. Throughout his life, he was modest about Bastogne, always deflecting credit to his soldiers and downplaying his own role. General George Patton was, in almost every way, the opposite of McAuliffe. Patton was flamboyant, aggressive, and controversial. He believed in himself with a conviction that bordered on megalomania. He was also genuinely brilliant at military operations, with an intuitive understanding of maneuver warfare that few could match. The relief of Bastogne was one of Patton's finest moments. He saw the crisis developing before others did. He began planning the relief before he was ordered to. And he drove his army with relentless energy to accomplish the impossible. Patton thrived in crisis, and the Battle of the Bulge gave him the crisis he needed to shine. But Patton was also difficult. He clashed with colleagues. He made enemies easily. His slapping of a soldier with combat fatigue nearly ended his career. After the war, he was removed from his command for making impolitic statements about denazification. He died in December 1945, just a year after Bastogne, in a car accident in Germany. The contrast between McAuliffe and Patton helps explain why the 101st's response to relief was so pointed. McAuliffe's style was about quiet competence. Patton's style was about dramatic heroics. When Patton's guys showed up acting like saviors, the 101st's response was essentially, "We don't need drama. We just need ammo." Let me also mention some of the enlisted soldiers who fought at Bastogne, because they are often overlooked in favor of the generals. Private Webster was a member of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. This is the unit that would later be made famous by the book and TV series, Band of Brothers. Webster was a Harvard-educated intellectual who had enlisted despite being eligible for deferment. His letters and later memoirs provide some of the most vivid descriptions of combat at Bastogne. Sergeant Leo Boyle was a squad leader in the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. During the siege, he led his men in numerous patrols and skirmishes. On one occasion, he captured a German patrol, bringing back valuable intelligence. He was wounded twice during the battle but refused evacuation. Private First Class Martin was a medic who worked in the makeshift aid station in Bastogne. He later described the horror of treating wounded soldiers without adequate supplies. He watched men die from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. He kept working anyway. Because what else could he do? These individual stories humanize the larger narrative. The siege of Bastogne wasn't fought by generals and divisions. It was fought by individual soldiers, each with their own fears, hopes, and motivations. They held not because of strategic considerations but because their buddies were counting on them. The esprit de corps of the 101st Airborne wasn't an abstraction. It was built on thousands of personal relationships between soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. Let's zoom out even further and talk about what Bastogne teaches us about military leadership and unit cohesion. Military historians often study Bastogne as a case study in defensive operations and unit resilience. What allowed the 101st to hold when other units might have crumbled? Several factors stand out. First, training. Airborne soldiers received the most rigorous training in the American military. They were physically tougher, mentally more resilient, and trained to operate in isolation behind enemy lines. This training paid dividends at Bastogne, where the normal support structures of the army were absent. Second, leadership. McAuliffe and his subordinate commanders set the tone from the top. They refused to panic. They maintained discipline. They made decisions quickly and stuck with them. The soldiers took their cue from their officers. If the general wasn't worried, why should they be? Third, unit identity. The 101st Airborne had a strong sense of itself as an elite unit. The soldiers believed they were the best. This belief became self-reinforcing. They acted like the best because they believed they were the best, and their actions confirmed their belief.